Welcome to Billy's Books. Today we're going to do John Oates' autobiography, Season of Change. Alright, welcome to Billy's Books. I'm reading a musical autobiography by John Oates. He is one half of Daryl Hall and John Oates, nicknamed Hall and Oates, but they prefer to be called Daryl Hall and John Oates at all times. So if you call it, just call them Hall and Oates, that's a shorthand, just so you know. So this is good. He starts out beginning by saying, if I don't talk about Daryl enough, it's not because I don't like him. I love him. He's my brother. But this is a book about me, not us. So Daryl comes up a lot, but it's really about John's life story. So he's raised as a sort of the first male grandchild of his generation, and for his Italian mom, that meant he was the king. So he was the boy king. He got everything, and then the fact that when they learned, like when he was 3 years old, that he could sing, forget about it. He was everything. Grandma loved him dearly. He's a good boy. He rocks. He sings beautifully. He's it. Of course, when he started studying music, he was like, I want to be Elvis Presley and play guitar. And his grandma was like, no, 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 no. And he quotes here, so by me using an accent, it's okay, because he wrote the accent in. Play a violin, Johnny. Real musicians play a violins, not the guitars. So, okay. As a 7-year-old, he was already going to voice classes and things like that, and his voice teacher took the whole class. I guess it was a standard thing, when you have a class of little kids for music, you take them places to sing Christmas carols. So one place his 7-year-old music class teacher took him was an insane asylum. Apparently they do this every year. So he describes in great detail being this little 7-year-old and being led down these scary hallways and hearing screaming and all sorts of stuff, and then being sat down in front of a bunch of people who were slumped over and moaning and stuff and trying to sing some Christmas carols. He tells that story with a certain amount of shock and awe. Then later on, he just tells more childhood stories. So he talks about when the men landed on the moon. He was tripping on acid or shrooms or something, and rolling around in one of the famous fountains in Philadelphia. He was rolling around someone had put bubble stuff in the fountain, and he was rolling around going, he's walking on the fucking moon, walking on the night of the moonwalk. So that's one of his crazy stories. He keeps telling about stories of his crazy youth before he settled down to rock and roll. So he hitchhiked in Europe right after he graduated from college, because that's what kids in the 70s did, and I suppose the 80s too. But of course he hitchhiked broke, and he had all sorts of terrible adventures and misadventures. He tells a story about sangria, which is very similar to my sangria story. My friends know that I have not had sangria since 1995. He tells a similar story. He also talks about driving through the Alps and how beautiful it was and things like that. And as he got poorer and poorer and poorer, he was like, I'm eventually going to go up to Denmark or wherever Scandinavia is and check out Christiania, which was supposedly this hippie utopia that was happening there. When he got there, of course, it was just a bunch of losers strung out and it was like a shithole. Needles everywhere, and just people kind of very much like an opium den, just kind of zombied out. So he didn't really enjoy that as much as he liked, and he was like, after a summer of that and landing there, he was like, I think it's time to go home. So when and then he finally got back to London, from London he tried to fly back to the States, and in London he had some hash in his shoes. He hid them in his shoes thinking that would be good enough, but then when they got to the airport, apparently the cops were all like just frisking everybody, and they were like, you frisky, you scruffy looking guy, and he panicked. And so he grabbed this. He was like, they had dogs, so he was like, that's not going to work, the shoe thing. So he took the hash and panicked and swallowed the whole chunk before he got on the plane. So he made it past the police, but then his trip back was terrifying because it was just a turbo prop over the Atlantic, And I guess that was kind of turbulent, and he was just freaking the whole time. He just tells all these great stories. Anyway, when he finally got back to the States, he had been subletting his apartment to some people who didn't pay the rent. So when he got back to his own apartment after that crazy trip, he couldn't get into his own apartment, so he scruffled over to Daryl's house. And Daryl's like, come on in, live in our attic. And him living in the attic of Daryl's house is when they began their songwriting relationship. And then he tells immediately the story about She's Gone, and how he met some girl in the midwinter of New York City. He met this girl who, where was it? She was, in the midwinter, he was sitting with him, he was decked out all weird and flashy, and he had and this girl in a pink tutu and cowboy boots without wearing a jacket in the middle of winter in New York City came in. She spotted him, he spotted her. She went right to his booth and sat down, and they immediately hit it off. And then later on they had a rendezvous back at John's apartment, and she was a no-show. So as he sat there and then realizing slowly over the hours that she wasn't coming, he slowly muttered, she's gone, she's not coming back, or whatever, da-da-da-da-da. And he had this little idea of a song, and next morning Daryl comes up and says, what's going on? He's like, oh, I don't know, man, she never showed up, and I just have this little riff. And Daryl heard it, he's like, oh yeah, went right over to the piano and started picking out some stuff, and they wrote a song together, and it was their first big hit. Apparently, he tells a lot of stories, the stories about how he had some weird sort of half-assed idea that was the chorus of something, and then Daryl shows up with the plays and figures out the verse on the piano. He seems to have a few stories about some of their big hits that go like that. John's a very gracious guy. I watched an interview with him recently, and it's, I always think that, Daryl Hall's kind of this knucklehead, and John's the reasonable one, and there's something to that. But John is reasonable, and Daryl is gregarious, but he's not a knucklehead. He's just got a good sense of humor, and he's an extrovert. Versus John's introverted nature, and so they kind of complement each other. He's like not just personally and not just musically, but other ways too. So anyway, they're both obviously really good musicians, and John in his book goes out of his way to acknowledge all the different people in his bands over the years. He's like obviously a good band leader. By the way, he acknowledges everybody's accomplishments, which I think is what a good band leader should do. After a while, in the mid-'70s, like everybody, he got into racing because he's like a guy that likes driving fast cars, so he ended up getting to meet Jackie Stewart, and I love this. Through Jackie Stewart, he got to meet George Harrison, and John knew better than to act all stupid around George, so he luckily had the common interest of cars to be sort of buddy and peer with George Harrison instead of like the whole time. So he got comfortable when they became good friends, to the point that later on even George would take him to his house both in LA and then later in England, took him back to Friar Park, which is a great honor, and he showed him around, and he just said he was the most gracious guy. Okay, so I'm just going to read this whole page and a half about them auditioning for their bass. They had auditioned a whole bunch of bass players, and they brought them down to these last two, who were both amazing players. One was this kind of frumpy bald guy who wore plaid shirts and wore a knit hat to cover the fact that he was balding, and this other amazing player who was super duper, like really like flashy and dressed in bright clothes and had really crazy coiffed hair and was very extroverted and all that stuff. And they were both amazing players, so it brought them to the last two. So I'm going to read that much. We were torn. The day of the final audition, Wolk came in with his beat-up bass in one hand and an old, weather-worn accordion case in the other. "What's the deal with that?" I asked him. As it turned out, at around the age of 12, he had become the New York State accordion champion and was a squeeze-box virtuoso. He had a session booked after meeting with us, and that's why he had the instrument with him. We asked him to play a little bit, and our collective jaws dropped. It may not have been right for us at the time, but we could all appreciate the authentic, exotic, zydeco music that flowed from his fingers dancing across the keyboard and buttons. He also modestly mentioned in passing that he played some keyboards and guitar as well, downplaying everything, which we'd soon learn was just his style. He was brilliant at all those things, but he'd never be the one to tell you that. So Tommy Wolk, who we like a lot, packs up his accordion case and departs. A few minutes later, enter the other guy. He and his coiffeur saunter into the rehearsal room and we begin to go through a few of the prepared numbers. We play Rich Girl, check. He's on his game. Then Kiss on My List. Yeah, he's got it down. Plays great, looks great. The gig began to tilt his way. After a few songs, we sat around talking to feel out his vibe. Musicianship is one thing, but chemistry also matters. Before you let a guy into your house, into the family, it's important that you get along. Was he the missing piece of our future rhythm section? A few minutes into our post-rehearsal conversation, he casually turns and says, "So Daryl, when I'm in the band, I think I should sing Kiss on My List." Needle scratch! Just like in one of those old-time westerns, when the saloon grows deadly quiet, and the shots ring out, and the bodies drop to the floor, silence envelops the room. The pause is deafening. He wanted to sing Kiss on My List. Cold, dead silence. Daryl finally breaks the sonic void like only he can. Sitting right next to me, he sharply turns his head towards me. "John, let's go with the bald guy." And that was it. The greatest decision we ever made. So, there's more stories about their adventures, how they, in the mid-70s they were big, they got some big hits, but then in the late 70s they started losing their hits and things were weird and they decided to self-produce, and when they started to self-produce, they started getting hits again, and so their albums from 1980 to 1984, they, like, four albums maybe? They just kept on squeezing out the hits for the early 80s, and they became superstars. And they reached such a point of superstardom that he keeps hinting that they're going to stop at their peak. So he starts the book out by saying, "Here we are at our peak, and then we decided to stop," and then he jumps back. And so now he's jumped back, and they're getting to the point where they're at the point where they stop. And I haven't read past that, which is sort of their semi-retirement. But I know for a fact that he eventually that John takes a break from the music business for like 9 years or something in the 90s, and he builds a new life in Colorado, and I think he gets all grounded and cosmic and escapes the ridiculousness of the 80s quite happily. And they're still around, so they can still do stuff. I think, they haven't really had the hits. I guess Daryl had some hits in the 90s. It's an interesting book if you are interested in musicians' biographies. If you don't care about Hall & Oates and aren't a musician, maybe you'd find it interesting. I don't know, but I do. Being a musician and liking Hall & Oates, I find it pretty interesting. So, if you can't do, review.